Greetings and blessings, everybody. My name is Fitz Rabin. I hope you all had a fabulous Pesach, Passover holiday. I have not shared a message over the last couple of weeks out of a commitment to the holiday. And now we're back. It's Sfira So'imer. I'm grateful and happy to have had a beautiful Yom Tov, beautiful holiday, and grateful to be back together with all of you. I bring to you today a beautiful letter from the Lubavitcher Rebbes. If you recall, maybe some of you have seen the video, maybe some of you have not. Around the time of Yom Kippur, around a half a year ago, I shared a tshuva, a responsum from the Tzemach Tzedek, the third Rebbe of Chabad, where he responds to someone who was very anxious over the fact that he had had a nocturnal emission of semen on the night of Yom Kippur. And he was anxious because of what the Talmud says about this phenomenon, that it's a sign that a person won't live out the year. And the Tzemach Tzedek responds to him that he had heard from his grandfather. He actually witnessed and his grandfather laughing at concerns like this, at anxieties like this. And he explained that the Talmud is speaking only to someone who is of such a pristine spiritual caliber, that the only possible reason why he might have a nocturnal emission of semen is because it is actually, in fact, a communication or a sign from heaven. But someone who's of ordinary character, who has lustful thoughts, who has temptation, who grapples with their own sexual desires on an ongoing basis, to have a nocturnal emission is really just a physical phenomenon, and it's not an indication of and it's not an omen of any kind. And as a matter of fact, the Tzemach Tzedek concludes over there that, and I invite you to go ahead and watch that video and study the text inside. The Tzemach Tzedek concludes that even a person's preoccupation and concern with not having a nocturnal emission on the night of Yom Kippur can actually elicit the nocturnal emission, and therefore he tells the person to just be in joy, be in peace, and release themselves from this entire preoccupation. This response of the Tzemach Tzedek seems to be a foundation of the Rebbe's response throughout the years to people who inquired to the Rebbe about concerns around sexual sins, nocturnal emissions. We don't see this clearly specified, but there are stories and interactions where the Rebbe even responded to things that are even more explicit, such as pornography viewing and other things relating to this. The Rebbe consistently takes the approach that's rooted in this response of the Tzemach Tzedek. And it's really a counterintuitive approach. And because it's counterintuitive, it can sometimes be difficult to wrap our heads around it and really apply it. Because we know that in the halacha, sexual sins, temptations, lusts, desires, certainly acting on them, is related to with such intense gravity. So that's why this message becomes counterintuitive. The message of hesech hadas, lower the stakes, lower the intensity of the preoccupation and the anxiety around this issue. That's counterintuitive. A person would ordinarily think, wait a second, if something is important, the more important it is, the more severe it is, the more significant it is, the more I should be preoccupied with the upholding of that value. But actually, when it comes to sexuality, when it comes to lust and temptation and desire, actually, the reality is that human beings work in the opposite way. When we have a very heightened state and a heightened preoccupation and a heightened anxiety around sexual purity, this actually has us revolving around it, which inadvertently feeds it and intensifies the proclivity and the chances of our engaging in negative sexual behavior. So it is counterintuitive, and it takes a degree of of trust and relaxation to be able to absorb this message in. But this is the consistent message that the Rebbe has to tell people. And here's a fascinating letter where the Rebbe brings this out, and I think there's a unique quality to this letter, and I want to share it with you today. And this that you write about the well-known issue. So the person who wrote the letter to the Rebbe basically wrote to the Rebbe about his own concerns about his own sexual purity. And he told the Rebbe that he recites Psalms before going to bed, presumably to help protect him, to sanctify himself. So the Rebbe is going to respond. But I just want to point out a very interesting expression over here. Inyan hayadua, the well-known issue. I think that a lot of us have a tremendous amount of shame around our sexual pitfalls and shortcomings. And oftentimes that shame is associated with a belief that we're the only ones. We're the only ones in the world, or we're the only ones in the community. We're the only ones who are grappling with these desires and temptations and who are falling through on our own values and renegating on our own commitment. And I think this is just so loving and affirming that the Rebbe refers to this as Inyan Hayadua, the well-known issue. This is the well-known issue. There's an acknowledgement over here that this is a well-known issue, the well-known issue. So it's actually not something that's exclusive to individuals at all, even though it's not often very discussed publicly. It's not a public discourse. It's not something that is engaged in conversation much, about much. It's the well-known issue. So we can all rest assured that we are not alone. This is something that is a well-known issue for most people. No matter how polished and beautiful and religious and holy and saintly a person may appear, and they may very well be, and that doesn't preclude this struggle. I think I've already written to him that the solution to this is Hesech Hadas. What is Hesech Hadas? In general, we're familiar with the expressions Chochma, Bina, and Das. Chochma is an experience. It's an experience, an aha moment, where a person experiences an epiphany. All of a sudden, the person's awareness is stretched, is expanded, and some new idea or some new awareness enters into them and expands their perspective. That experience of expansion, that experience of that something new being planted into a person's consciousness, we call Chochmah. Bina is a process. It's a process of trying to give form to that insight, to that thing that was experienced, to try to put meat on the bone, to try to give it articulation, to think it through, to integrate it into everything else that we know already, or to readjust or recalibrate the way we see things in light of the new thing that came in. That's Bina. Das is attachment. Das is when the person begins to identify with this new awareness after they've experienced a new opening and they've engaged in the process of integrating it, understanding it, articulating it, formulating it. Now Das is like when a person begins to become attached to it, it's like almost on the level of identity, right? A person, it's no longer just an abstract theoretical idea. It's not something out there, but it's something that a person identifies with. It's something that a person is really attached to and beginning to develop a kind of a personal connection with. That's Das. Hesech Hadas is to really create a detachment. So very often we have a relationship with our concerns and our preoccupation with our sexual purity that is one of Das. It's like we're very attached to it. Like it's like an existential issue. It's like our identity is at stake. And the Rebbe is saying the solution is hesed hadas. Detach, unhook your sense of identity from this issue. Lower the intensity, the personal attachment with this issue. That will actually help. That will actually help. Das, identity, existentiality, personal identification and attachment is not appropriate when it comes to upholding the values of the Torah around sexuality. Because when our identity and our existential worthiness and value is invested in it, it just has us intensifying it without even realizing. And to detach and unhook all aspects of personal worth, personal worthiness, identity, attachment is not fighting with it. It's not to fight with negative thoughts, or with lustful thoughts, or with temptation. It's not to fight with it. But simply to detach from it. And to turn a person's attention and to turn our thoughts to something else. And what would be ideal would be to turn our attention to words of Torah, tefillah. Because if a little bit of light expels a lot of darkness, how much more so a lot of light expels darkness. But fundamentally, the Rebbe is saying this issue of our sexuality, of our lust, of our desires, of our temptations, of that which leads to us being out of integrity with the Torah's values around sexuality, this is not an issue it's not conducive for upholding the value to be overly personally attached and for a person's identity to be at stake around these issues. Too much intensity, too much at stake, that feeds it, it complicates it, and it propagates it. Hesed hadas is detach any sense of personal worthiness, any sense of identity, any sense of this being a personal, high stakes personal issue, and turn your attention to other things, particularly to Torah. There's a counterintuitive approach, but that's how sexuality works in the Rebbe's view. And that's how, over time, we gain more and more mastery, actually, over sexual impulses. And the Rebbe concludes, this fellow had written that he says Tehillim before he goes to sleep to protect himself. And the Rebbe says, even your recitation of Tehillim is the opposite of Hesed Hadas. Because the context inside of which this person was reciting the Tehillim was a preoccupation and anxiety with sexuality, even upholding the Torah's values of sexuality. So if that is what's precipitating the Tehillim, you're actually still feeding the anxiety, you're still feeding the intensity, you're still feeding the attachment. So even to recite Tehillim before you go to sleep feeds the attachment, which undermines the objective. If the context for the recitation of the Tehillim is linear, is a continuum of a person's obsessive preoccupation or fearfulness or anxiety or attachment to their sexual purity. And the Rebbe actually concludes the letter that in any event, our custom is not to recite Psalms, not to recite Tehillim from nightfall until midnight, except for on special occasions like Yom Kippur and so on. So to conclude, it's Inyan Hayadua. You're not alone. This is the well-known issue to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe is writing this to the person he's responding to, and obviously publishing it for the world to know. This is the known issue. You're not alone. You're not the only one at all. This is the known issue. Whether it's acknowledged in the streets or in public discourse or not, this is the known issue. Second of all is hesed hadas. It's a counterintuitive approach. It's a counterintuitive solution. Detach that sense of personal worthiness, personal value. Detach that sense of identity. Hesed hadas. Unhitch. Remove the das, the intensity of attachment from this issue, and turn your attention to other things, particularly to Torah. This process itself is not just the Rebbe saying, oh, after the fact, just move along. No, he's not just saying that. He's saying this process of Hesed Hadas is actually the way to ultimately mitigate and diminish engaging in inappropriate, less than ideal sexuality. I hope you enjoy this. I hope this is helpful to you. And if you'd like to be in a further conversation with me for creating your life, your reality, whether it's around this subject or whether it's around creating your life from the inside out rather than being reactive on all levels, material, spiritual, whatever it is, please, I'd be happy to hear from you. And I would love to be in conversation. I love you. Thank you for receiving this.